Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Rookie Card Collector 123 video. In today's video, we're going to continue our look at some more highlights from my journey to 310, how I assembled the most diverse baseball Hall of Fame rookies collection of all time. The first player we're going to talk about today is one of those guys that spanned the turn of the century. He played briefly in the late 1890s and then played through the entire first decade of the 1900s and then into the 19 teens as well. The ball player today is going to be Nap Lajoie. We're going to speak of first. Lajoie spent the earlier part of his career with the Philadelphia Athletics. I believe they were called the Athletics at that point. I'm not 100% sure. They might have been the Phillies when he first started. But he came over when the American League first formed in 1900, 1901. Lajoie would become the first American League superstar in baseball. He actually won the Triple Crown in the American League that first season, 1901, leading the league in batting average, home runs, and RBIs. So Lajoie was a second baseman primarily, and making his offensive achievements all the more incredible as a middle infielder. Something totally not expected at this time frame where middle infielders were primarily just there mainly for their defense, and if they can hit a little bit and bat, 270, 280, ball club was usually pretty happy with that. But Lajoie would go on to become a much bigger star than that, much bigger offensive force. And the beginning of my journey for the Lajoie rookie, um, I held off on getting a T206 card because that was obviously well into his career at that point. That was 1909 to 1911 era. So I looked to try to go back a little bit earlier than the T206 to avoid myself having to ultimately sell that off when I found something else anyway. So the first Lajoie I ended up picking up was a pretty rare postcard. It was a Cons 1907 Cleveland Indians postcard, and Lajoie appeared in there as a portrait image. I believe there's currently one on eBay that's got kind of a pretty rough crease going through his head, as his head takes up the majority of the card there. But it was in 1907. It predated the T206 by somewhere between 2 and 4 years, depending on which year the tobacco card would have been issued. So I picked that one up, and I had that in my collection for a couple of years. This is around 2007 or so now. And I started to go after more and more of the fan craze cards. At that time, the Fan Craze American League was believed to be a 1904 release. It has since been determined to be 1906, which matched the original National League catalog date as well. So Lajoie was in the Fan Craze set. He was in the American League. So when I was collecting it, it was an '04 issue I was after. And those were findable back in those days, and they were usually a Hall of Famer like Lajoie might be in the high hundreds. He might be like 600, 700, $800. So after a little bit of searching, I was able to pick up a Lajoie. I think it was a graded a 6, so it was pretty decent condition, considering a lot of my cards were 1s and authentics and 2s. So I picked up the Lajoie Fan Craze, and I had that for a couple of years, and started searching. Now I'm getting into the late 2000s, the near 2010. And at that point, I started to pick up, I went back to a lot of the Fan Craze players, and many of them had images in the turn of the century, the Sporting News supplements, which was a very oversized issue. If they were full size and not trimmed at all, they measured around 9 inches by 12 inches or so. They came with the Sporting News newspaper, and they were issued between 1899 and 1900. They always had the week that the supplement came out printed right on there, so you knew exactly which year it was from. So at that point, I saw that Lajoie had a supplement in that series, which would predate my fan craze, which really ended up being in 1906 by about 7 years. So I set out to find a Lajoie and was lucky enough to pick one up in an auction within a year or so. And it was happened to be a nice copy. I think it was a Beckett. At that time, Beckett was the only company with a holder large enough to encapsulate those M101-1 sporting news supplements. And I believe it was a 2.5, so it was one of the highest graded that I had, probably one of the highest that were graded, period. I believe I was the first collector that submitted anything from that issue, the M101-1 sporting news supplements, to Beckett and got them to grade it and encapsulate it. Prior to that, none of the other companies, of course, had a holder large enough, and Beckett had not graded any prior to then. So I had the Lajoie Sporting News supplement, was very happy with that, wasn't really anticipating finding anything earlier. But not too long after that, maybe a year or so, I was looking through I believe it was an eBay listing. I was just doing a search for Lajoie to see what happened to be out there. And I came across a Lajoie that was listed as 1897, which was 2 years before the M101-1. So I looked into the listing more, and it comes out that the Lajoie listed there was the front cover image of him batting with a catcher and an umpire in the background behind him. So it was basically almost a full page image of the Leslie's Illustrated, which was a popular newspaper back in the 1880s, 1890s that provided a lot of coverage on Major League Baseball. So it had Lajoie batting with Philadelphia on the front cover, and it was dated, I forget the month and the date, but it was 1897. So it was 2 years older than the M101 that I had. And it was not a lot of money. I think it was under $100 because basically it's just a newspaper. It's not a card or anything, or even a supplement or anything like that. So I decided I'm going to pick that up. I'm going to sell the M101-1, which maybe nets me close to $1,000, and that would be a nice amount of money I could use towards some other Hall of Famers that I needed to spend bigger amounts on. And it would, at the same time, it gives me a Lajoie, which is 2 years earlier than the item I had. So that's what I ended up doing. I ended up getting it matted and framed by a professional, kept the whole newspaper intact. And eventually, when I went to sell it, I believe I ended up getting about $400 for it. So it was nice. I made a few bucks on it. That was not really the objective. The M101-1 was obviously the much better piece to have. But the Leslie's Illustrated cover, really served the purpose of what I was trying to do with my collection. So this would be, I believe, my second newspaper that I had bought, and I haven't covered the other one yet. We'll get into the story of that later on when that player comes up in my discussion about the road to 310. So my final Lajoie was that Leslie's Illustrated from 1897. The next one we're going to talk about is one of the Negro League guys. This is John Henry Pop Lloyd. Lloyd was a premier shortstop. He came up to the professional Negro League, so was not an official Negro League formed until 1920. Lloyd started playing professionally around 1907 or so, primarily in the upstate New York area initially. He played for the New York Lincoln Giants. He also played for Rube Foster's Chicago American Giants later on. Played many winters in Latin America, including Cuba, where he spent numerous seasons over there. So upon starting to dig into the Negro League players, Lloyd was one that I held off on buying the Lachlan Old Time Black Stars from 1974, as I had done with many of the other Negro League players, anticipating that I was never going to be able to find an actual card of them. But Lloyd, I was aware there was a few cards. They were all very rare and very expensive back in that day anyway. Back then, expensive was a few $1,000s and up. Today, it's things are a lot different. But anyway, so I tried to look for a Pop Lloyd, and he's in a few of the 1920s Cuban issues. He's in the Aguilitas set. He's in the Beacon set. He's in the Tomas Gutierrez set. So there was a few there available. They always seem to sell for more than what I wanted to spend or what I could afford to pay for them. So the search continued for a while for a Pop Lloyd. Eventually, I came across, it wasn't a Pop Lloyd card, but I came across a 1923 to 24 Tomas Gutierrez, which was the tobacco company that printed a Cuban series in 23, 24, like I said. And there was an album that went along with it. That was the case with almost every Cuban baseball issue, starting with the 19 teens, but especially more so even during the 20s and then into the 40s as well and early 50s. So I became aware of this Thomas Gutierrez album that was up for sale in an auction. And the album, instead of being unlike most albums where it has a spot and it's usually identified by name underneath the spot in the album where the player's card is supposed to be pasted onto. Well, these Tomas Gutierrez Cuban card albums, they included the identical image that was on the actual card printed in that spot on the album. So basically, once you got the actual card, you pasted it directly on top of the image which was already printed in the album. So it was easy enough, obviously, to tell whether you actually had the card or you just had the image from the album. But they both were basically identical almost. So this album came up, and there was four, maybe five or six Hall of Famers in there, and then there was one Hall of Famer who actually had appeared in two different teams. I believe he got traded or signed with a second team during the middle of the season, so he actually appears in the same set twice with two different ball clubs, two different images, and that was Cristobal Torriente. But there was five or six other Hall of Famers in there, including Pop Lloyd. And I decided I was going to try to pick up this album because the cards in there, all the images of the cards were identical to the real actual cards. And then I would try to have Beckett, what I was going to do since I was under the impression that all my cards in the collection needed to be graded. I couldn't grade the album or anything like that, or even the pages in the album. But what I did was I decided if I win the album, I'm going to cut out with a paper cutter all the individual cards, really the Hall of Famers. The other cards I wasn't as concerned about. Take out the Hall of Famers, and then I'm going to submit them to Beckett and show them what the album looked like before, where these items came from. You know, they're obvious. It's obvious that they're not real cards. The paper stock was much different. The back of them was blank as opposed to the tobacco advertising that was on the original Cuban cards, and the hopes that Beckett would encapsulate them and just label them as Tomas Gutierrez album Pop Lloyd hand cut or something like that on the label. Then of course it would just get an authentic grade. You know, I was not looking to get any sort of numerical grade because I knew that was not possible. So I win the album. It was sometime. It was around there. It was somewhere around $3,500 or so. But now I had seven Hall of Famers, which are nearly impossible for me to buy the actual cards at the prices they were selling for at that time. So I have all those Hall of Famers now. So I cut them out. I reached out to Beckett. I mailed him the cards. You know, told him what I was thinking. And sure enough, a couple of months later, I got everything back, encapsulated just the way I asked them to do it with the Tomas Gutierrez album, hand cut, and the individual players. And I had Oscar Charleston, I had Jose Mendez, I had Andy Cooper, I had Pop Lloyd, I had Torriente, and I had a second Torriente. So that would fill a number of spots in my six or seven spots in my collection for Hall of Fame Negro Leaguers. very early on, and I would have those album hand cut cards for quite a while in almost every case. But eventually, I believe all six Hall of Famers would end up getting replaced by other team photo items or postcards or something else that was earlier than the 23-24 Tomas Gutierrez release. But anyway, so for Pop Lloyd, I had the 23-24. I was pretty happy with that. And moved forward. This again was probably around 2000, somewhere between 2007, 2009 now. So not too much after that, I came across a Hunt auction. It was a live auction. Hunt was one of the bigger auction houses in terms of Negro League material back at that time. And they were going to have I got the catalog and it had a Chicago American Giants team real photo postcard. And it was from 1914. And I had seen this postcard previously on eBay, maybe a year before or something like that. I saw the exact same postcard, and I forget exactly how the seller on eBay identified it, but a lot of people in my collecting circles, that were somewhat familiar with Negro League stuff, there was some hesitation as to the legitimacy of it and all, and the players being identified if they were who they were identified to be. So, long story short, I ended up not getting it on eBay. I believe it ended up selling for something like 2,500 or 2,600, something like that, which would turn out to be a steal in the long run because it was a legitimate postcard. But anyway, it's up for hunt auction, so now it's encapsulated. So now everybody's, realizes that it's real and it is what it's said to be. And it's got Rube Foster in there as the coach slash, I guess, owner of the Chicago American Giants. I don't know if he was the owner, but he was basically running the business end of things. And it also had Pop Lloyd in there as he was with the team in 1914, which was the season that postcard photograph was taken. It also had Pete Hill. It also had Bruce Petway, who's not in the Hall of Fame yet, but he's a great Negro League catcher from the really early Negro League days. So anyway, I decided I'm going to go after this postcard, and it ended up costing me a lot of money, but I was able to end up winning that 1914 postcard, which meant I can sell off then my Pop Lloyd, Tomas Gutierrez, the album hand cut card. So I did that. I picked up that postcard, and that would fill a spot for Rube Foster, Pete Hill, and Pop Lloyd. And that would stay in my collection actually, it would stay in my collection till the end because I was never able to get anything earlier for, um, I believe it was Rube Foster. So, so now I'm kind of happy with my Pop Lloyd. I'm not expecting to get anything earlier. I knew there was one actual card of Lloyd that was from 1910. It was a Cuban series again. It was called 1910 Punch Cigars. That was super rare. And a couple of years earlier, it had sold in a Hakes auction for almost $100,000. So actually, obviously, that was way out of my budget. And at that point, I think there was only two of those known, two or three maybe. So I obviously was not getting that. So I was happy with my 1914 Chicago American Giants real photo postcard. But not too much later, probably within a year or so, I'm looking at more Negro League auction stuff, and I came across the 1911 New York Lincoln Giants, which was one of the early teams I mentioned before that Lloyd played on. So that postcard was up for auction, and it included Lloyd. It also included Dick Redding, who was known as Cannonball Redding, who was a great Negro League pitcher, not yet in the Hall of Fame, but I'm sure will be one day. Also included Louis Santop, who was one of the earliest great Negro League catchers, probably the greatest early catcher in Negro League baseball. And it also included Sol White, who was I guess he was a manager at that point. I don't think he was still active playing. His playing career went all the way back to the 1880s, and Sol White is in the Hall of Fame as a Negro leaguer and I believe a contributor as well. So it's got Sol White, Louis Santop, Pop Lloyd, Cannonball Redding, and some other stars. I don't think anybody else in the Hall of Fame. And again, this ended up costing me a lot of money. I ended up purchasing it from an individual who knew I collected big Negro League material. I ended up purchasing it from them in a private sale. That would end up replacing my Pop Lloyd in the collection. This was 1911. And of course, I was never going to get the 1910 Punch cigars Cuban card of Pop Lloyd. So that Lincoln Giants team postcard would be my ultimate final Pop Lloyd in the rookie collection. So I was going to cover one more player today, but I see we're at a little bit over 20 minutes already. So I'm going to cut off the video at this point, and I'll continue next time with the next major Hall of Famer we're going to talk about in my journey to 310. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the stories today. It's a lot of fun going back and reminiscing, and of course, always in the end, wishing I still had lots of those things in my collection. But I guess it can be said it's better to have once owned these items than never to have owned them at all. So that kind of makes me feel a little better, I guess. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a great day, and I'll catch you guys again on the next one.